The world is reacting tonight to a dramatic escalation in travel restrictions imposed by the Trump administration. These sweeping measures target multiple countries, many in Asia, throwing travel plans into chaos and raising concerns about their long-term impact. Families are being separated, businesses are left in limbo, and diplomatic relations are strained. Tonight, we're diving deep into this developing story. In a bold move, President Trump has unveiled new travel restrictions targeting several countries. But which Asian nations are on this list, and what does it mean for their citizens? Stay tuned as we explore the 10 Asian countries facing these unprecedented US travel bans. We begin in Afghanistan, a nation grappling with the scars of decades of conflict. The Trump administration has implemented a total suspension of visa issuance for Afghan nationals, citing security concerns as the primary driver. They point to instances where potential threats slip through the cracks, putting American lives at risk. But critics argue that this blanket ban is a blunt instrument punishing an entire nation for the actions of a few. The human cost of this ban is undeniable. Families hoping to reunite are torn apart. Students with dreams of studying in the US see their aspirations dashed, and professionals seeking opportunities are left with few options. The Afghan government has denounced the ban, calling it discriminatory and counterproductive. They argue that they've been cooperative with US security demands and that this measure will only serve to further isolate and destabilize their nation. Our next stop takes us to Iran, a nation with a long and complicated history with the United States. The Trump administration has maintained a complete visa ban on Iranian citizens, citing the country's alleged support for terrorism and its destabilizing activities in the region. They argue that allowing Iranian nationals into the US would pose an unacceptable security risk. But critics argue that this policy is rooted in a misguided hawkishness that ignores the realities on the ground. The ban has had a devastating impact on Iranian Americans, many of whom have been separated from loved ones for years. The Iranian government has condemned the ban as discriminatory and illegal, arguing that it violates the rights of its citizens and further inflames tensions between the two countries. Turning our attention to North Korea, we find a nation shrouded in secrecy and ruled by an iron fist. The Trump administration has maintained a total visa suspension on North Korean citizens, citing the country's nuclear ambitions and its abysmal human rights record. They point to the regime's history of provocations and its unwillingness to engage in meaningful diplomacy as evidence of its threat. But some experts argue that this policy of isolation is counterproductive, doing little to curb North Korea's nuclear ambitions and only deepening the suffering of its people. The ban has effectively cut off almost all contact between the United States and North Korea, making it nearly impossible to build relationships or foster understanding between the two countries. The North Korean government has remained defiant in the face of international pressure, continuing to develop its nuclear and missile programs while denouncing the US as its main enemy. It has also made it extremely difficult for humanitarian organizations to operate in North Korea, hindering their ability to provide aid to those in need. Chapter 4: Myanmar, a shadow over democracy's promise. Our journey takes us next to Myanmar, a nation struggling to emerge from decades of military rule. The Trump administration has imposed partial visa suspensions affecting select visa categories, citing concerns over human rights violations and the country's fragile political transition. They argue that Myanmar's failure to address these atrocities and hold those responsible accountable warrants a targeted response. But critics argue that these partial suspensions punish the wrong people. Myanmar students hoping to study in the United States are facing uncertainty and delays, while activists and human rights defenders are finding it more difficult to travel and advocate for change. The Myanmar government has defended its record, arguing that it is committed to addressing the Rohingya crisis and bringing those responsible to justice. Chapter 5: Laos, caught in the crossfire. Our next stop takes us to Laos, a landlocked nation in Southeast Asia often overlooked on the world stage. The Trump administration has imposed partial visa suspensions on Laos, Citing concerns over insufficient security protocols and information sharing, they argue that Laos has not done enough to address concerns about its border security and its ability to track and monitor potential threats. But critics argue that these suspensions are based on flimsy evidence and that Laos poses no real threat to United States security. Laos students and professionals seeking to travel to the United States are facing delays and uncertainty, while businesses and investors are growing wary of engaging with a country facing United States sanctions. The Lao government has maintained that it is committed to cooperating with the United States on security matters, and that it has taken steps to address the concerns raised by the Trump administration. Chapter 6. Pakistan, a 60-day ultimatum. Our journey takes us next to Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation grappling with internal strife and a complex relationship with the United States. The Trump administration has issued a 60-day ultimatum to Pakistan, demanding that it improve its security measures or face partial visa suspensions. They also want Pakistan to improve its passport security and data sharing to prevent terrorists from obtaining travel documents. But critics argue that this ultimatum is unrealistic and counterproductive. The impact of this ultimatum is already being felt. The Pakistani rupee has plummeted against the dollar and businesses are bracing for the worst. Ordinary Pakistanis are worried about the future and the potential for increased instability. The Pakistani government has reacted angrily to the ultimatum, accusing the United States of scapegoating Pakistan for its own failures in Afghanistan. Our next stop takes us to Eritrea, one of the world's most isolated and repressive nations. The Trump administration has imposed partial visa suspensions on Eritrea, citing the country's lack of cooperation in accepting deported nationals. They say that this lack of cooperation poses a security risk and undermines U.S. immigration enforcement efforts. But human rights groups argue that these suspensions are cruel and unjust. The impact of these suspensions is being felt most acutely by Eritrean families who have been separated by the U.S. immigration system. Many are now facing the agonizing choice of remaining in the U.S. without legal status or returning to a country where they fear for their lives. The Eritrean government has remained defiant in the face of international criticism, denying any wrongdoing and accusing the U.S. of meddling in its internal affairs. It remains to be seen whether the pressure from the U.S. will lead to any change in Eritrea's policies. Our journey takes us next to South Sudan, a young nation ravaged by civil war and famine. The Trump administration has imposed partial visa suspensions on South Sudan, citing the country's ongoing conflict and instability. They argue that the ongoing violence in South Sudan makes it impossible to conduct proper vetting of visa applicants, posing a potential security risk to the United States. But humanitarian groups argue that these suspensions are heartless and counterproductive. The impact of these suspensions is being felt most acutely by South Sudanese families who have been separated by conflict and displacement. Many are now facing the agonizing choice of remaining in refugee camps with dwindling resources or risking their lives to return to a war-torn country. The South Sudanese government has condemned the suspensions, arguing that they are unjust and counterproductive. They insist that they are committed to ending the conflict and rebuilding their shattered nation, but that they need the support of the international community, not its isolation. Our journey takes us next to Syria, a nation ripped apart by a brutal civil war that has raged for nearly a decade. The Trump administration has maintained a complete visa ban on Syrian citizens, citing the ongoing conflict and the threat of terrorism. They argue that Syria has become a haven for terrorist groups, including ISIS, and that allowing Syrians into the US would pose an unacceptable security risk. But human rights groups argue that this ban is discriminatory and inhumane. The impact of this ban has been devastating for Syrian refugees, many of whom have been languishing in camps for years with little hope of resettlement. It has also torn apart countless families, leaving loved ones stranded on opposite sides of the world. The Syrian government has denounced the ban as discriminatory and counterproductive, arguing that it does nothing to address the root causes of terrorism and only serves to punish the Syrian people. Our final stop takes us to Cuba, an island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, yet worlds away in terms of its political and economic system. The Trump administration has maintained a total visa suspension on Cuban citizens, citing the country's communist government and its alleged support for terrorism. They argue that Cuba remains a state sponsor of terrorism and that its government continues to oppress its people and violate human rights. But critics argue that this policy is outdated and counterproductive. The impact of this policy has been felt most acutely by Cuban-American families, many of whom have been separated for decades. It has also made it difficult for Cuban students and professionals to travel to the US for educational and cultural exchanges. The Cuban government has denounced the ban as discriminatory and hypocritical, arguing that the US has no right to lecture others about human rights while maintaining its own embargo on the island. They also point to Cuba's close ties to Venezuela, another country with which the US has strained relations. The Trump administration argues that these stringent travel restrictions are necessary to protect the American people. They say that in a world facing complex threats, the US must be vigilant in safeguarding its borders and vetting those seeking entry. But critics argue that these policies are counterproductive, driven by fear and xenophobia rather than sound security assessments. As this debate rages on, one thing is clear: the human cost of these policies is real. Families are being torn apart, dreams are being shattered, and the lives of countless individuals are being upended. These stringent measures reflect the administration's focus on national security. For more updates on global policies and their impact, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.